Hello, everybody. This is what I'm going to call music history with Matt. I don't get a lot of time to talk about music anymore because, and ain't nobody want to hear that. But I've got some interesting things to talk about. And today we are going to talk about the best album that never was. So, the Beach Boys, in my opinion, are the best band that have ever existed. You may think of the Beach Boys as this Surfer Girl, Surfing USA, Surfing Safari, Surfing, Hang 10, all that jazz. And that's what they were in the early 60s. However, Brian Wilson, the leader of the group, had a nervous breakdown on an airplane in 1964 and decided to stay home from touring and focus on songwriting. And the result was Today, which employed a lot of Phil Spector's Wall of Sound, a lot of real lyrics, a lot of love songs. This is Brian, by the way. He wrote and recorded this album while the boys were away touring with professional musicians called the Wrecking Crew. And that's a story for another day, the Wrecking Crew. So, anyway, after they released Today, the record label got a little mad. They didn't like that it was different, so they released Summer Days and Summer Nights. And as you can see, they're on a boat there. Guitarist Al Jardine is missing from this photo um, for whatever reason. There's the genius Brian again. Um, but this employs even more so the Wall of Sound and the professional musicians and California Girls, who which we all know is on this album, and it's very complexly written and recorded. It's been compared to Aaron Copland at the beginning. If you ever listen to it, just listen to the beginning, and you'll hear, if you know Aaron Copland, what we're talking about. So, after Summer Days and Summer Nights, there was this big kind of promotion that Brian Wilson is a genius. They called him a genius. And so he was kind of had free reign to do whatever he wanted. So he, while the boys were in Japan touring, wrote and recorded Pet Sounds. The best album ever released, Pet Sounds. Okay? And that is not just my opinion, that's the opinion of a lot of greatest albums of all time lists. However, when it was released, it didn't do so hot because people were expecting California. And this doesn't have a lot to do with California or surfing. It's very personal lyrics, which were written by Tony Asher. Um, and it's very complex arrangements. The song God Only Knows is a big standout. Very complex chord changes that I can't believe anybody ever thought of, let alone somebody who used to just be the leader in a surfer group. And it was just the best album. So, now on to the best album that never was. Brian set out to write what he called a teenage symphony to God. Um, and he teamed up with a lyricist named Van Dyke Parks, who wrote some far out lyrics. One that stands out is Culminated Ruins Domino. And it was different. But Brian was suffering from some mental illness that was definitely made worse by his drug use. He was doing some LSD and a lot of marijuana. So he would go into these sessions and just do the craziest stuff. The bandmates recall, Bruce Johnston in particular recalls Brian making them lay down on the floor on their backs and make barnyard noises. And that makes sense because there's a song all about out in the barnyard. Um, so he got really far out, and there was one point where they hired studio musicians to come in, and he couldn't do it because the vibrations in the room were bad. And he really believed in vibrations, as evidenced by the single that came out after Pet Sounds, Good Vibrations. This is a really cool limited edition record, too, by the way. But Good Vibrations was actually their biggest hit ever to be released, and that was released after Pet Sounds. Between Pet Sounds and the album that never was, Smile. But the vibrations he really started to believe in, and he canceled sessions because the vibrations in the room were bad, and they were paying musicians to do nothing. And then it kind of came to a head when they were recording a song called The Elements, Fire. And there were supposed to be other elements, never were. And he used a very eerie kind of vocal arrangement and very strange instrumental arrangements to simulate the Great Fire of Chicago back in 18 whatever. And coincidentally, there were a number of fires in LA that night, and he, in his delusional mind, thought that he had caused the fires. And so he claimed to have burnt the tapes. It's actually a myth that you can burn tapes. They will not ignite, but he did stow them away. And they were later released, and I'll get to that in a minute. But when it came down to it, he canceled the album because Mike Love, the lead singer of the group, didn't like it. Van Dyke Parks didn't even like it after a while and avoided the sessions. He said the music was too esoteric for pop music, and by today's standards, it's pretty tame, but I guess in the 60s it was different. And that it was just freaking him out. He was very paranoid. Still a genius, very paranoid. So, the record label still needed a album. So they released a makeshift album, that's what I call it, called Smiley Smile. This is actually an original pressing. Smiley Smile was met with confusion and almost hostility. It's actually very similar to the Beatles' White Album in how bizarre it is. It uses stripped down versions of the Smile tracks, mostly recorded on radio transmission equipment in Brian's basement. And they were high as all hell the whole time they were recording it. And it was very rushed. Carl Wilson refers to Smiley Smile as a bunt instead of a grand slam. So that is what happened to Brian's Teenage Symphony to God. It turned into a bunt instead of a grand slam. And it's very unfortunate. But nevertheless, they persevered. They released an album that I've got here somewhere the next year called Wild Honey, where they all played their own instruments again. And this was mostly led by Carl Wilson. Brian took a hands-off approach to most of the albums that came after Wild Honey. This does have fragments of songs from Smile, like Mama Says. So they did start using fragments of Smile. They released on 2020 a song called Cabinescence, the album 2020, called Cabinescence, which was kind of a bizarre track, and it was from Smile. So Smile goes down in history as the most famous and most legendary unreleased album of all time. Now, it was kind of released in 2004 when Brian Wilson and his band re-recorded what is the closest thing to Smile we may ever have, and also in 2012 the Smile sessions were put together, which are fragments of the actual songs. And it is literally the closest we will ever get to hearing Smile. Um, it's a real shame that we never got to hear the real thing because it really could have beaten Pet Sounds even. It could have been better than Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Um, the way it's put is that Rubber Soul made Pet Sounds, and Pet Sounds made Sergeant Pepper's. So it could have been the one after Sergeant Pepper's. It wasn't. It was just never created. It was shelved until the late 2000s. And it goes down in history as the most notorious and the most well-known and famous unreleased album of all time, which is a strange title, but given the background that Brian was a genius who lost his mind, did too many drugs, and got delusional, um, could not finish the album, and the Beach Boys persevered, with or without Brian. And Brian did come back for some later albums, and Brian is alive and touring today. He's doing much better, which I'm happy to say. He's still a genius. But it's a real shame that Smile was never released and never beat Pet Sounds. So Pet Sounds remains number one on my top albums list and always will, unless the original Smile somehow gets finished and released, which will never happen. It's impossible. Half the people are dead. So that is Matt's music history for Thursday, October 24th. And I'll drop another one on you guys probably next week. So awesome. Thanks for listening. If you got through all 12 and a half minutes of that, and go listen to Pet Sounds. Promise you will not be disappointed. Bye.